All right, so the 6 principles, just like a way to think about how to comply with this, and I've sort of talked about what it is, and again, we're going to have some detail around whether or not an individual is relevant or not, but what are you supposed to do? So anyone that's handling personal data that for someone who is GDPR compliant, a data subject, that you want to make sure that the data you're handling is processed fairly, lawfully, and in a transparent manner, that it's used for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes, it's used in a way that is adequate, relevant, and limited, that it is accurate and kept up to date, it's kept no longer than is necessary, and it's processed in a manner that ensures appropriate security of the data. Now, I would argue that these 6 principles are reasonable principles for any data privacy policy at an institution, right? Now, you can argue about whether or not, you know, that the liability of violating one of these, but making sure that you are, you know, that you fairly, lawfully, and transparently dealing with someone's data. The transparent is an interesting question, which we'll talk about, and that you're using it for legitimate purposes and in a relevant and limited way, right? So if you think about some of these, you know, that you're processing fairly, lawfully, and transparent, that would be that, you know, I don't get your data and then, you know, do things with it well, I mean, this is sort of interesting. It's like if someone wants to know what you're doing with their data, you need to be able to tell them, and that's a bit of a tricky problem. The second one is that you're using it for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes. So as you know, you're dealing with students' data, and actually there's differences between what you're maybe doing on the marketing side and recruiting side versus once you have someone as a student. And actually, I think that once you have someone as a student, that the compliance becomes less important because you have a much broader legal basis, as they say, for use of that data. However, when you talk about relevant and limited use, like if you take their information as for all of your students and you sell it to a local bank so that they can try to advertise credit cards to them, like that, I think based on this principle, like that's not necessarily relevant use without some sort of opt-in for the people to have done that. Now the retention is another issue. Now retention, again, this is not about like your student records, right? It's more about the marketing data and things like that. So once you have actual, contractual operational data around someone like a student, the retention is not really what they're talking about. They're more about, retaining information about someone that they've, that's not relevant to the actual, interactions with you as an organization. Like someone can't say, please forget my bill you owe me that I owe you, right? You can't keep that data. Like as long as they still owe you money, you can keep that bill going. And then lastly, and this is a bit vague, admittedly vague in the clause, that you need to basically have some best practice of security around the data. I think I got another question here, and I'll take it. If we do not have any students that are citizens of any of the GDPR countries, do we need to worry about this? That is a good question. So we will talk about that, but why don't I hop right into that question? And before I do that, let me just skip over this slide really quickly. This is actually on our site, this McKinsey link. So what I talked about sort of 6 purposes. They also boil it down to lawfulness, fairness, transparency, purpose, limitation, data minimization, accuracy. So there's a number of different sort of ways that people have boiled down this like multi-page law into some points. McKinsey has one, the other 6 points I just shared. So if you go to the community.datacookbook.com and go to the GDPR section within there, there's links to a number of these sources, and I think the